I want to thank all of you for coming. I won't say anything about the rain because it does rain in California, but we don't often have Dr. Panofsky in California. I would like, it is a very special, the UCLA Art Council feels not only proud to present this wonderful event, but to be able to participate in it. It is also a little bit sadly and with a great deal of reluctance that I announce that this is the last in the series of lectures. One of the most important men who has made this series possible is the chairman of the art department, who is Dr. Birkmeyer, that I would like to present now to present our marvelous man, Dr. Panofsky.
Mrs. Burton, my dear Dr. Panofsky, on behalf of the Department of Art, its students and its faculty, I would like to thank you for having accepted the invitation of the Art Council to give these annual lectures. These lectures, the days with you, are just memorable events. We do thank you. And instead of, if I may reverse the tables, instead of introducing you to an audience who knows you and admires you, may I present an audience that is grateful for your coming. Ladies and gentlemen.
My dear Mrs. Burton, my dear Mr. Birkmeyer, ladies and gentlemen, fellow students, I thank you for your very warm welcome, and I must say that I begin this concluding lecture with more than usual regret for because this is the last time I shall be in contact with an audience which I believe is the most responsive and in a way nicest I have ever enjoyed. Now, to turn to the subject of our entertainment tonight, except for portraits, Titian's secular paintings may be divided grosso modo into two classes. First, allegories, where mythological characters, gods or goddesses, heroes or heroines, must be taken to personify general concepts or principles, such as peace, war, love, etc. Second, narratives, where these same mythological characters are to be interpreted as concrete individual personalities, whom we must understand not according to what they signify or stand for, but according to what they do or suffer. For pictures of this second class, in Titian's own terms, favole or poesie, he normally found his textual inspiration in Ovid. This is not unusual nor surprising. No other writer, classical or modern, treated so great a variety of mythological subjects and was so widely read, commented upon, paraphrased, and illustrated from the very inception of West European humanism. Not for nothing do many editions and paraphrases of Ovid's Metamorphoses bear such subtitles as Bibel der Poet, Malerbibel, or Schilders Bible, all of which means Bible of painters. Yet Titian's relationship to the poet between two worlds, as he has been called, is rather special. He must have felt an inner affinity to an author full of sentiment as well as of wit, sensuous as well as aware of mankind's tragic subjection to destiny, And it was precisely this inner affinity which enabled Titian to interpret Ovid's texts both literally and imaginatively, both with minute attention to detail and in a spirit of uninhibited freedom. No other great artist drew so important visual conclusions from a single phrase in an Ovidian text. Yet no other major artist hesitated so little to supplement an Ovidian text with other sources, and even in at least one case to change its essential significance. The earliest of Titian's Ovidian narratives, a prime example of multiple derivation, is his final contribution to the decoration of Alfonso d'Este's studio in the castle at Ferrara. The Bacchus and Ariadne, now in the National Gallery at London, for which the Duke had to wait from circa 1518 until the spring or early summer of 1523. The subject of the picture is so unusual that the gentleman who recorded all the paintings illegally removed from Ferrara to Rome in 1598 could not properly identify it. He describes the work as a picture of square format in which Laocoon is depicted. This statement is understandable in that the snake-encircled figure on the right, in the right-hand foreground, bears a distinct resemblance to the Vatican group, especially if seen from the side, of which a plaster cast must have become accessible to Titian just about 1520. That the painter included this snake-encircled figure at all is due to the fact that he depicted the train of Bacchus on the basis of a description in Catullus, which with more conventional motifs such as the brandishing of thyrsi, the beating of cymbals and tambourines, etc., specifically includes certain votaries girding themselves with coiling serpents. Par sese tortis serpentibus incingebant. This Catullus passage accounts, however, only for the equipment and behavior of Bacchus's followers. In Titian's painting, the actual subject was inspired by Ovid, and characteristically by two different passages, neither of which is found in the Metamorphoses. One of these passages is Ovid's glowing evocation of Ariadne's second and final encounter with Bacchus in the Fasti. Abandoned by Theseus on the island of Naxos, Ariadne is rescued by Bacchus, who finds her asleep on the shore. Then he too deserts the poor girl to conquer India. She walks on the water's edge in despair, declaiming against the faithlessness of both her lovers and wishing for her death. But Bacchus, having returned from his triumph and having followed her from behind, a tergo forte secutus, appears to her for a second time. He dries her tears with kisses, and she dies in his arms to share his immortality. Let us attain together the summit of heaven, says the god. The jewels of her diadem are transformed into the constellation known as Corona, the Cnotian crown. Already clearly discernible in the upper left-hand corner of Titian's picture, and it is only by the phrase a tergo forte secutus, following her from behind, that we can account for the averted posture of Ariadne. But to explain the action of Bacchus himself we have to postulate the additional influence of another Ovid text, the Ars Amatoria, first book. Here, the difference between Bacchus's first and second encounter with Ariadne is deliberately obscured. Bacchus calls Ariadne his wife, promises her immortality, and announces that the Cnosian crown will always direct the doubtful ship at sea, but she still sighs and weeps for Theseus as if he had just left and she had never encountered Bacchus before. It is the Ars Amatoria and the Ars Amatoria only which supplies the textual basis for the most unforgettable motif in Titian's unforgettable picture, the swift bound of Bacchus from his chariot. As John Keats was to phrase it when he had become familiar with Titian's painting. This said, the god did from his chariot leap, that's from the Ars Amatoria, lest she be frightened by his tigers. Dixit et e curu ne tigres illa timeret decilit. It has long been observed that Titian borrowed the pose of this Bacchus from a classical Orestes sarcophagus. And follows it fairly literally. But here as elsewhere, Titian bettered the instruction, unifying as well as intensifying the rhythm of his classical model. He lowered the right arm, brought the head down to a level lower than that of the raised shoulder, and provided the figure with wings, as it were, by adding a crimson mantle billowing back with a magnificent sweep. The idea of the leap, however, was suggested by Ovid's Decilet. One small but significant change is the replacement of Bacchus's tigers, which the poet in turn had substituted for the classical panthers with smaller felines, spotted rather than striped, which the experts have identified as cheetahs, hunting leopards. Their substitution for Ovid's tigers would seem to have been motivated by two considerations. First, the painter wished to gratify his patron's interest in rare exotic animals, an interest characteristic of most Renaissance princes, but as marked in Alfonso d'Este, that in 1520 he requested Titian to portray a gazelle, which he had heard was kept in the Palazzo Cornaro in Venice. Titian dutifully went there, only to learn that the animal had died, but he fulfilled the Duke's desire by producing an enlarged copy of a drawing once made by Giovanni Bellini. Second, and more importantly, Titian wanted to make it perfectly clear that Bacchus had returned from India, the home of cheetahs. Inconspicuous though it is, their presence confirms this assumption that the subject of Titian's picture is Bacchus' second and final encounter with Ariadne. In assimilating the god to Orestes, Titian transformed the man who kills what he hates into a god who destroys but thereby immortalizes what he loves. It took an interval of more than 20 years and a special concatenation of circumstances to call into being Titian's next mythological narrative, the Danae at Naples. Painted in 1545 for Ottavio Farnese, the natural grandson of Pope Paul III, this picture served a threefold purpose. It was meant to please a young prince with the depiction of an erotic subject, to do justice to a classical myth of which no classical representation was known in the Renaissance, and to challenge Michelangelo. In Ovid, the story of Danae, the beautiful daughter of Acrisius, king of Argos, whom her father had imprisoned in a tower of bronze in order to protect her from any intercourse with men, but who, approached by Jupiter in the guise of a golden shower, became the mother of Perseus, is frequently alluded to, but never circumstantially told. The Middle Ages, unfamiliar with any representational transition of the Danae myth, depicted and interpreted her according to context in many different ways. She may appear in the Middle Ages, right-hand slide, as a contemporary princess surrounded by a bevy of young ladies in waiting, whom Jupiter approaches disguised as a courteous salesman of jewelry. She may appear as a personification of modesty, Pudicitia, protected by her tower, which thus became a symbol of chastity. There she is sitting in the tower on top. Or even as a prefiguration of the Virgin Mary. If Danae, says a 14th century Dominican by the name of Franciscus de Rezza, conceived from Jupiter through a golden shower, why should the Virgin Mary not have given birth when overwhelmed by the Holy Spirit? Jan Gossard, 16th century early, could develop a charming, childlike Danae from the medieval Pudicitia type. The Italian Renaissance, however, started afresh, and except for a number of charming hapax legomena, most of the Cinquecento and Seicento renderings fall into two classes. In one, which includes, for example, Annibale Carracci's famous Danae, unfortunately lost, formerly in Bridgewater House, and Rembrandt's no less famous picture in the Hermitage, which you have before you. The figure of the heroine conforms to the Venetian type of a reclining Venus, so that expectation is substituted for fulfillment. In the other type, it conforms to Michelangelo's Leda of 1530, where we witness the climactic moment of what Goethe calls the loveliest of all scenes. This Leda type was adopted by Primaticcio in his Leda of Fontainebleau, painted sometime after 1540, and by Titian in his Naples picture still on the screen. It is just possible that Titian knew Primaticcio's composition through indirect sources, but certain it is that both Primaticcio and Titian developed their compositions from Michelangelo's Leda of 1530, which was demonstrably familiar to both of them. I have no doubt that Titian's heroic Danae was intended to compete with the Leda of Michelangelo, who on the occasion of a visit to Titian's Roman workshop praised it highly, as one does in the painter's presence, says Vasari. Privately, he restricted this praise to color and technique, but regretted that the Venetian painters had never learned the principles of good drawing. But there are, needless to say, as many differences as there are similarities. Michelangelo's Leda lowers her head and closes her eyes as in a dream. Titian's Danae consciously, blushingly, and joyfully abandons herself, and her pose, the foot of the raised leg firmly supported by the couch instead of being suspended in mid-air, gives the impression of both rapture and relaxation. In addition, 2 or 3 other threads seem to have gone into the fabric of Titian's composition. He must himself have looked at the classical source of Michelangelo's Leda. a Roman relief transmitted through a 16th century drawing, original is lost, which anticipates Titian's picture not only in the position and action of the supporting arm, but also in the presence of a Cupid on the right. But in dramatizing the posture of this Cupid into a violent awestruck contrapposto with a movement of the head opposing rather than following that of the torso and the legs, Titian emulated not only the Lysipian Eros bending his bow in the Capitoline Museum, but also, perhaps even more so, his favorite among Michelangelo's statues, the risen Christ in Santa Maria sopra Minerva. You see, I'm speaking only of the Cupid in Titian's composition. In the summer of 1554, about 9 years later, Philip II, then still Crown Prince, received a second edition of Ottavio Farnese's Danae, which had been in work in the preceding year and is still preserved in the Prado. From an iconographical point of view, we can observe a stronger accentuation of both the erotic and the ominous elements. The presence of a little dog, the rumpled bedclothes, the omission of the loincloth in favor of a Venus pudica gesture, which as so often accentuates what it pretends to conceal, lend a more intimate character of the scene. Moreover, the expression on the blushing face of the much smaller, de-heroized, and if I may say so, de-Michelangelized Danae is so enraptured, yet so remote, that she seems to die in the Elizabethan sense of the word. On the other hand, the atmosphere is one of dark foreboding. The golden shower, almost reddish, bursts forth from the dark clouds in a somber, thunderous sky. Jove, one may say so, appears as Jupiter Tonans, manifesting himself not in a gently descending stream of gold, but in a terrific explosion, and the hideous old nurse, who has replaced the Lysipian Cupid of the earlier version, serves par antiphrase, as the French say, to stress the miraculous nature of an event which in the old woman excites only greed, but transforms her young mistress into the chosen vessel destined to give a savior to the world. In the letter of 1554, which refers to the second Danae, as already in Philip's possession, Titian announces the shipment of another mythological narrative, which, despite the considerable difference in size and format, he considered a kind of companion piece of the Danae, a Venus and Adonis. According to Titian, this Venus and Adonis would look nice in the same Camerino because it showed the female form from the back, where the Danae showed it in front view. Still other aspects, he goes on to say, he hoped to give in renderings of Perseus and Andromeda and Jason and Medea. The Venus and Adonis was first sent to Madrid, but it was soon forwarded to London, where Philip then resided as the newlywed king consort of Mary Tudor. It arrived sometime before December 6, 1554, on which day Philip very angrily complained about its condition. It was disfigured by a horizontal break in the middle, severing the head of Venus from her body, and is still designable. This break, in fact, serves to distinguish the original in the Prado from the many replicas and variants produced with or without Titian's personal participation in his workshop. In fulfilling his promise to show the female form from the back, Titian had recourse to a classical model distinguished by the fact that a nude figure seated and seen from the rear is turned in such a way that head and feet are pointing in opposite directions, a feat by no means easy to repeat. About the nearest analog I could find is the nude in the so-called bed of Polykletos. But it is through the intermediary of, I think, the beautiful Hebe in Raphael's Marriage of Psyche in the Capella, in the Villa Farnesina, this figure here, that Titian had encountered and was able to imitate the classical motif. In an attempt to justify this inversion of the Venus figure, Titian left the path of the established illustrative tradition and, in a very real sense, rewrote the whole myth, for which he was severely censured by a contemporary art critic, Raffaello Borghini, as early as 1584. The locus classicus for the story of Venus and Adonis is a long passage at the end of the 10th book of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Accidentally wounded by one of Cupid's arrows, Venus, the goddess of love, falls herself in love with Adonis, the beautiful huntsman. She loves him so dearly that she herself takes up hunting in a small and harmless way. Adonis reciprocates her love, but the goddess fears his passion for big and dangerous game. Mingling her words with kisses, she warns him against pursuing such animals as lions, bears, or boars, and to prove her point, she tells him how she had engineered the transformation of Hippomenes and Atalanta into a lion and a lioness, thereby incurring the everlasting hatred of warlike beasts. Warning him once more, she leaves the scene of their pleasures and departs for Cyprus in her swan-drawn chariot. It is only after her departure that Adonis's courage defeats her admonitions. Left to his own devices by her, he goes boar hunting and meets his death. This tale conjures up an image entirely different from Titian's painting. Ovid's Adonis, responsive rather than recalcitrant, does not break away from the entreaties of Venus. Only after her airborne departure does he yield to the temptation of the chase. Titian's Adonis, however, tears himself away from Venus almost as Joseph tears himself away from the wife of Potiphar, while Cupid, reduced to impotence, lies on his back. The illustrated Ovid editions contain, as a rule, only two Adonis scenes: Venus and Adonis as happy lovers, she holding him in her lap, and her lament after his death. It was Titian who invented what may be called the flight of Adonis in contradistinction to the leave-taking of Venus, as represented, for example, by a drawing by a later Venetian painter named Antonio Molinari, where we see Venus, just as in Ovid, departing on her swan-drawn chariot and leaving Adonis alone on earth. We are tempted then to look for a Renaissance text which might have interposed itself between the Metamorphoses and Titian's bold transformation of the leave-taking of Venus into a flight of Adonis. But not even the learned editors of the New Variorum edition of Shakespeare have succeeded in finding such a text. Now, why should Shakespearean scholars have bothered to look for it? Because they are troubled by the same problem as are the art historians. Shakespeare, like Titian, interprets Adonis as a reluctant lover. And in stanza 136 of his Venus and Adonis, he describes his flight from Venus as follows. With this he breaketh from the sweet embrace of those fair arms which bound him to her breast, and homeward through the dark land runs apace, leaves love upon his back, deeply distressed. Look, how a bright star shooteth from the skies, so glides he in the night from Venus' eyes. Reading these lines, an art historian is bound to doubt the assumption that Shakespeare fused or confused his hero with such truly frigid or misogynist characters as Glaucus, Narcissus, Hippolytus, or Hermaphroditus. Shakespeare's words, down to such details as the nocturnal setting, the love upon his back, deeply distressed, sound like a poetic paraphrase of Titian's composition. And given the fact that the painting ordered by Philip II had remained in England for several years and was widely accessible in 16th century prints, one by Giulio Sanuto, dated 1569, the other by Martino Rota, dated 1583, so I venture to propose that Titian, just as he was to inspire Keats with the swift bound of Bacchus, inspired Shakespeare with a new version of the Venus and Adonis story, a version well motivated, as we have seen, on purely artistic grounds, that is to say, by his intention to present the principal figure from the back, but not anticipated, it would seem, in any literary source. In the letter of 1554, we recall Titian had promised to favor Philip II with two further pictures displaying the female form, a Jason and Medea and a Perseus and Andromeda. Of the Jason and Medea, no trace of further mention can be found, whereas the Perseus and Andromeda may well be identical with the wonderful painting in the Wallace collection at London, to which we shall soon return. But before this painting was delivered, Titian dispatched to Spain two other Ovidian mythologies, which, according to a letter of June 19, 1559, were then nearing completion. In September of that year, they were on their way to Spain. One was Diana and her nymphs, surprised in their bath by Actaeon. The other was Diana discovering the pregnancy of Callisto. This is the Actaeon scene on the left, and this is Diana and Callisto on the right. In contrast to the Danae and the Venus and Adonis, these two paintings are counterparts in the strictest sense of the term, matching each other to perfection in format, size, composition, and content. There's every reason to believe that they were meant to be placed on the same wall, the Actaeon picture on the left, as it is shown now, the Callisto picture on the right. Both paintings are dominated by nearly symmetrical systems of intersecting diagonals and exhibit curtains symmetrically placed in the upper corner. Both pictures show a rectangular pillar in the middle distance, slightly shifted to the right in the left-hand picture, and slightly shifted to the left in the right-hand picture. And both show Diana in the role of a beautiful and cruel goddess of chastity, wreaking her vengeance upon an innocent victim. A most distinguished and sensitive critic, Alice Waterhouse, has called the Diana and Actaeon the first Baroque composition. In many ways, this judgment, which may be applied to the Callisto composition as well, is justified. There is a horror of uprights and horizontals in both. Even the basin of the fountain in the Actaeon scene is tilted, and so, for that matter, is the pedestal of the fountain statue in the Diana and Callisto. The mountains, woods, and cornfields in the background are, as Waterhouse aptly puts it, a descending current. The figures in the second plane are darkened in toto, as though a shadow had fallen over them, and the dominant colors, chiefly blue, crimson, white, and golden brown, stand out with that glowing yet menacing clarity which can be observed before a thunderstorm. Yet this trend towards the Baroque is counteracted by two other currents: the continuing influence of classical art and a renewed and very powerful impact of Mannerist tendencies. The elements of the composition are held together neither by the unifying force of light and shade, nor by a kind of gravitational pull into depth, but what I should like to call a rhythmical concatenation, which operates primarily within or parallel to the picture plane. And the figures are more elongated and, as it were, more easily movable at the joints than is compatible with the standards of both the Baroque and the High Renaissance. A direct borrowing from a Mannerist composition has long been recognized in the nymph seen from the back in the center of the other composition, which has now disappeared and which is anticipated in a famous composition by Parmigianino, a bath of Diana, which must have been very, very famous because we know it in quite a number of replicas. The whole idea of shifting the accent from Diana and Actaeon to Diana and her nymphs in their bath may well have been prompted by Parmigianino's apparently extremely popular composition. The story of Actaeon is told, that's now again this here, is told at great length and with great power in the third book of Ovid's Metamorphoses. The unfortunate huntsman innocently surprises Diana and her nymphs in the Boeotian woods where they are bathing in their sacred spring. Outraged, the goddess sprinkles his head with water, cruelly exclaiming, "Now tell that you have seen me naked, provided that you are able to tell." He is transformed into a stag and torn to pieces by his own hounds. Titian's picture shows only the first act of the tragedy, the unpremeditated, fatal invasion of Diana's privacy. What is to come is indicated by only a symbol. The stag's head affixed to the pillar. I'm afraid it's too dark for you to recognize. In representing Actaeon before the change, Titian harks back to the woodcuts in the earliest illustrated Ovid editions, beginning with the first, published at Venice in 1497. Most later illustrations show Actaeon proleptically with the stag's head on his shoulders. Such is the case, for example, with several miniatures and paintings with a woodcut in the Trasformazioni of Titian's good friend Ludovico Dolci, which appeared in Venice in 1553, and with Bernard Salomon's woodcut in the famous Métamorphose d'Ovide figurée of 1557, which is the woodcuts in which edition may be called the greatest small woodcuts in all creation. Titian's beautiful and sinister composition differs, however, from all its predecessors, and so far as I know, also from all its followers, not only by such personal touches as the red curtain and the Negro servant girl, somewhat incongruously attending Diana, but also by the unexpected presence of an architectural setting, a curious combination of a rusticated pier with a dilapidated Gothic vault, the only Gothic vault in Titian's oeuvre. But just what looks like a triumph of poetic license is in reality the triumph of an imagination fertilized by attentive reading and intelligent thought. There was a valley, now I'm quoting of it, densely filled with pines and pointed cypresses, sacred to short-skirted Diana, Ovid says in setting the stage for the fateful event. In its utmost recesses, there is a sylvan cave, not produced by any art. Nature's own genius had imitated art. Simulaverat artem ingenio natura suo. She, nature, had erected a natural arch of light pumice stone and soft tufa. In the mind of a 16th century painter, well acquainted with such architects and theorists of architecture as Sebastiano Serlio, this description of an arch contrived by nature's own genius in imitation of art was bound to conjure up two closely interrelated concepts: the concept of rustication and the concept of the Gothic style. Rustication was recommended for such intentionally artless artifacts as fountains and grottos. Serlio actually calls a rusticated piece of architecture part work of nature and part work of an artist. And Gothic was considered a natural style derived from those primeval shelters which were supported by unsquared timbers instead of by columns shaped and proportioned according to the rules of architecture, a style whose piers still seemed to look like trees and whose pointed arches still seemed to retain the memory of living branches bent and meeting in mid-air. Titian thus took his clue from Ovid's description, but he reversed the accent. Instead of depicting a cave where the genius of nature had imitated art, he depicted an architectural setting where art had followed the genius of nature. For him and his contemporaries, a Gothic vault, combined with a rusticated pier, was a man-made equivalent of what Ovid describes as a structure produced by nature in imitation of art. And the ruined state of this structure, together with the inclination of the basin already noted, gives the impression that nature is reclaiming her own. Like Actaeon, Callisto, whose story is told in the preceding book of Ovid's Metamorphoses, is a guiltless victim of divine injustice. A daughter of Lycaon, king of Arcady, Callisto belonged to the retinue of Diana. When she rests unguarded after a strenuous chase, Jupiter, insidiously assuming the appearance of Diana herself, caresses and violates her, leaving her pregnant. 9 months later, Diana and her nymphs decide to have a bath. Callisto, ashamed of her condition, refuses to join in and is forcibly undressed by her companions. Diana banishes her from her flock and she gives birth to a boy named Arcas. The ever-jealous Juno first mistreats her and then transforms her into a she-bear. As such, she leads a miserable life for many years until her own son, grown into a great hunter, nearly kills her. At this moment, Jupiter intervenes, transposing mother and son to the firmament. Callisto is transformed into the constellation known as the Ursa Major, the Great Bear, mostly referred to as the Wain in English. Alcas, the sun, is transformed into the constellation of Boetes or Arctophilas, the bear's keeper. But Juno, still vengeful, forces the bear to stay above the horizon for all eternity, so that she may not find refreshment and purification in the ocean as the other constellations do. In style, Titian's Diana in Callisto exhibits, like its companion piece, a combination of mannerist tendencies and classical influence. Even the little water carrier serving as a fountain statue has many, many classical ancestors. In iconography, however, the picture remains, like its counterpart, a creation almost ex nihilo. The previous representations of Callisto's banishment have no appreciable relationship with Titian's composition. Where the discovery of Callisto's pregnancy is shown at all, she is depicted standing, and the scene tends to be combined with her seduction, with her mistreatment by Juno, or even with her flight from the sun long after her transformation into a she-bear in Dolce's Trasformazioni, where you see the poor she-bear in the back, scarcely able to save herself from her very vigorous son. In style, Titian's Diana and Callisto exhibits, like its companion piece, a combination of mannerist tendencies and classical influences. But as I said, in iconography, the previous representations are quite different, and Titian stands apparently on his own. Nowhere, not even in a series of 12 engravings, all devoted to the myth of Callisto, do we find a precedent for the two features most characteristic of Titian's picture, the interpretation of Diana as an imperious figure sitting in judgment, so to speak, and above all, the beautiful and cruel violence of the undressing scene, with the unfortunate victim writhing on the ground. To re-encounter the second of these features, we must go forward to Rembrandt's early and rather vulgar picture in the collection of Prince Salm. And the very idea of combining the stories of Actaeon and Callisto in one painting may not be without significance. And it is in the Callisto section of Rembrandt's painting that we find concrete reminiscences of Titian, not only in the humiliated victim, but also in some of the nymphs, notably the one seen from the back. A problem is posed by a second version of the Diana and Callisto picture preserved in the Vienna Museum, on your right. It differs from the Edinburgh original not only by its area, less compact composition, but also by an attempt to reduce the amount of naked flesh. The gorgeous nude on the left is replaced by a draped figure resuming a contrapposto movement which Titian had repeatedly used some 20 years before, and Callisto herself has not as yet been deprived of her clothes. The puzzling fact is that the underpainting of this Vienna picture, which was discovered about 50 years ago when the painting was recanvassed, literally agrees with the original, from which we must conclude that what had been planned as a straight replica was changed at the last moment, so to speak, into a variant. I incline to believe that the Vienna picture in Austrian possession from at least the early 17th century is one of those 7 full-scale replicas of nearly all the mythologies executed for Philip II, which had been produced in Titian's workshop and were offered to and probably accepted by the Emperor Maximilian II in 1568. This offer, made under the tacit assumption that the paintings were authentic works of Titian, was transmitted through Maximilian's Venetian envoy, a gentleman named White von Dornberg, in a letter of November 28, 1568. The list enclosed in this letter mentions, in addition to the Callisto, an Actaeon surprising Diana in her bath, which is of course the picture now in Edinburgh, but it also mentions a picture showing the horrifying sequel to this unintentional sacrilege, the fable of Actaeon transformed into a stag and torn to pieces by his own hounds. A painting of this description is referred to as having been started by Titian himself in his letter to Philip II of 1559. There is no evidence, however, that it ever reached Madrid. We are justified, therefore, in surmising that the only Actaeon torn by his own hounds attributable to Titian, not as yet, paid for, is still extant in the collection of the Earl of Hereford, now on deposit in the National Gallery in London, and traceable to the collections of Archduke Leopold William of Austria and Queen Christina of Sweden. That picture apparently belonged to the set offered to Maximilian in 1568. In the Ovid illustrations of the Renaissance, the actual death of Actaeon is rarely represented. And where it occurs, particularly in Bernard Salomon's Metamorphose d'Ovide figuré, he is entirely transformed into a stag and thrown to the ground to meet his end. The whole composition resembling an ordinary hunting scene, such as the famous miniature in the Trérisseur de Chantilly. In Titian's picture, however, the intermediary stage of transformation is reserved for the finale of the story. Actaeon, still human, except for the head, is on his feet and desperately struggling to hold his own against his dogs. And just the fact that his body continues to be that of a human being, while his head has become that of a speechless animal, lends a terrific actuality to the words of Ovid, which I think Titian had in mind when he conceived his composition. He longed to cry out, "I am Actaeon, recognize your master." But the words refused obedience to the will. Verb animo desunt. No less remarkable is the fact that the gruesome scene is relegated to the middle distance. The front plane is occupied by the superbly graceful figure of the victorious goddess who streaks through the woods, shooting her arrows, utterly at peace with herself and the world. Here again, Titian's imagination seems to have been fired by a few lines in Ovid. The latter's account of Actaeon's end concludes with the words, not till he had died from his many wounds was the wrath of quiver-bearing Diana assuaged. The third and final pair of mythologies produced by Titian for Philip II consists of two canvases showing respectively the rape of Europa on the left and the liberation of Andromeda by Perseus on the right. It seems singularly fitting, though it is probably quite accidental, that two unmitigated tragedies should be followed by two tales ending happily. Europa, as will be remembered, became the queen of Crete, or even a goddess, and gave her name to 1/3 of the world. And that the cycle beginning with the miraculous conception of Perseus by Danae should end with his most brilliant deed. The rape of Europa, first mentioned in Titian's letter of 1559, already referred to twice, was sent to Madrid about 3 years later, to be exact on April 26, 1562. And it is now, as you know, the glory of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. The history of the Andromeda, promised to Philip as early as 1554, is still a little problematical. We cannot even be absolutely sure, although it's quite probable, whether the picture now in the Wallace collection in London is identical with that sent to Philip II in 1567, or whether it maybe belongs to that set of replicas offered to Emperor Maximilian II in the following year. Certain it is, however, that though probably started shortly after 1554, the Andromeda did not receive its final form until Titian had decided to pair it with the rape of Europa, which was, we remember, in work from 1559 to 1562. These two compositions, the Europa on the left and the Andromeda on the right, are almost ideal counterparts. Both are essentially seascapes. Both are controlled by diagonals running from lower left to upper right in the rape of Europa, and from lower right to upper left in the liberation of Andromeda. And in both pictures, one of the upper corners is reinforced, so to speak, by balanced masses. The Perseus figure in the Andromeda picture, a couple of cupids in the rape of Europa. The rape of Europa is circumstantially described by Ovid, second book, and then again in Fasti, fifth book, and the subject has so long and consistent a tradition in literature as well as art that all representations of it have a kind of family likeness. From an iconographical point of view, even Titian's picture holds relatively few surprises and does not presuppose his acquaintance with such recondite authors as Moschus. That the bull is white and wears a garland put on his head by Europa herself, that she holds on to one of his horns, that she lifts her feet to protect them from the waters, that her scarf is blown back by the breeze. All these enticing details were set down by Ovid himself, repeated and embroidered upon by dozens of paraphrases, and frequently exploited by artistic renderings long before Titian. Bernard Salomon's woodcut in the Metamorphose Figurae of 1557, for example, agrees with Titian's picture, even in that the landscape is dominated by a sizable mountain, and the motif of a little Cupid riding a dolphin was at home in North Italy even as early as about 1495, and curiously enough, this is known to us by the fact that Dürer, on his first trip to Italy, copied an early Renaissance Europa which includes this motif of a little Cupid riding a dolphin. Yet even within the limitations of an unusually uniform tradition, Titian's painting remains original not only in its almost iridescent colors and in the agitated yet perfectly balanced composition, it remains original even in interpretation. The most obvious anomaly is the pose of Europa herself. She reclines rather than sits on the back of her bull, displaying, as has been said, her ample charms in a pose of ungainliness which only fear can sanction. True, the element of fear does enter Titian's composition just as it enters Ovid's description. She is afraid and carried off, looks back to the relinquished shore. Pavet haec litus quablata relictum respicit. But Titian's Europa looks upward rather than back. She reveals, in addition to fear, a kind of rapture befitting a mortal maiden carried away by a god. In her facial expression, in the position of her legs, even in the shadow crossing her face, in all these respects, she bears, I feel, a more than accidental resemblance to the Danae in the Prado, that's to say the later version. Were it not for the different movement of the arms, she might be called a Danae seen from above. In this movement of the arms, however, Titian's Europa differs not only from the Danae, but also from the Ovid text and from all its previous illustrations, including Bernard Salomon. According to Ovid, Europa should clutch a horn of the bull, usually the horn nearest to her, while with one hand, while the other hand rests on the bull's back. But Titian's Europa uses her right hand to raise her scarf, as though attempting to protecting herself from the arrows of the Cupids. And with her left, she clasps the farther horn of the bull, her arms thus passing behind his neck. Just as the position of her body suggests surrender as well as fear, so does the action of her arms suggest an embrace as well as a desire for self-preservation. The liberation of Andromeda, based on a passage in the fourth book of the Metamorphoses, owes, we recall, its present appearance to a thorough remodeling after 1559. In the original composition, apparently conceived 4 or 5 years earlier, and sufficiently advanced to leave clear traces of a first state in the X-ray photograph, which you see on your right, the figure of Andromeda is not only less elongated than in the final version, but also differently posed. Instead of floating, as it were, before the rock, one arm raised, the other lowered, she stands firmly on the ground, both arms chained above her head. And Perseus, though this is less certain, seems to come to her rescue on foot rather than in flight. We have then a supervening influence which changed the composition, conforming to the standards of about 1555 to those of about 1560. And once more, the combined effect of mannerism and classical antiquity can be discovered. The extreme elongation and sweepingly calligraphic design of the Andromeda seems to reflect the impression of such models as Parmigianino's Bain de Diane, possibly even that of Benvenuto Cellini's relief now in the Bargello at Florence, where you have an Andromeda also so elongated and a little bit contorted in a mannered sort of way as in Titian's composition. And the graceful S-shaped curve of her arms is reminiscent of classical menads. These reminiscences, however, might not have come to life in Titian's mind had they not been called up by Bernard Salomon's woodcut of 1557. It was published just a few years before the composition was revised. Here the new S-shaped curve formed by Andromeda's arms, originally both upraised, you remember, is clearly anticipated. And while this woodcut shows Perseus borne by Pegasus, the earlier Ovid illustrations, notably that in the Venice edition of 1508 and Cellini's relief, are based on the idea that he can cleave the air with his own foot wings. This is precisely how Ovid himself imagined the scene. Perseus, resuming his wings, ties them to both his feet. And here again we can observe that Titian not only looked at prints, pictures and works of sculpture, but also read the text. There are three features for which, so far as I know, there is no precedent in the representational tradition of the Andromeda myth. First, branches of coral can be seen on the shore, not in the slide, unfortunately. Second, Perseus, in a Tintorettesque foreshortening, and not often encountered in Titian, plunges down heels over head rather than head over heels. Third, he brandishes, instead of a normal sword, or as in Bernard Salomon's woodcut, even a spear, a weapon sharply curved and looking like a crossbreed between scimitar and sickle. In all these respects, I think Titian took his cue from the Metamorphoses text itself. Here the origin of the coral from seaweed turned into stone by contact with the Medusa's head is narrated at the end of the Andromeda story. Perseus' weapon is thrice referred to as crooked, curved, or sickle-shaped, and his descent from the air is graphically described as head foremost, praecaps. Like Dürer in his Apocalypse, Titian could achieve a phantasmagoric effect by following a text ad litteram. As Titian's last religious painting, the Pietà in the Accademia, is in a sense a farewell to the antique and Michelangelo, so is his last mythological painting, the Nymph and Shepherd, in the Vienna Museum, likewise unfinished and supremely beautiful, a farewell to the antique and Giorgione. It has long been observed that the reclining nude in this picture is patterned after a composition by Giorgione, partly transmitted through an engraving by Giulio Campagnola, and in turn derived from a classical source. Needless to say, Titian not only transformed but transfigured his model. He added a shepherd holding but not playing a flute. He placed the nude upon a panther's skin. According to Renaissance authors such as Landino and Ripa, the symbol of sensuality. And he turned her head away from from her companion. He also provided her with a left arm, the curious position of which intensifies the impression that she has withdrawn from her companion into a world of her own. And he enveloped the whole scene in the mystery of a strangely cheerless, bucolic landscape with a goat nibbling at the foliage of a lonely, broken tree, a landscape where a maximum of tone is combined with a minimum of color. That a painting of this size, nearly 5 by more than 6 feet, should be a mere genre piece, as its conventional title implies, appears improbable, and various interpretations have been suggested. Another pictorial comment on the relationship between the senses of sight and hearing, Diana and Endymion, Daphnis and Chloe, Venus and Aeneas, Orpheus and the Maenad. But the scene is too much fraught with restrained emotion to be an allegory, and this emotion is too somber for any of the mythological suggestions proposed. To me, these despondent lovers, so near to each other in body, yet so far apart from each other in sentiment, have always suggested the story of Oenone, one of the most pathetic figures in Greek or rather Hellenistic mythology. Oenone was a fountain nymph living in the Ida Mountains near Troy. She was dear to Paris when he, banished from his father's court, lived as a lowly shepherd rather than a prince. Abandoned by him in favor of Helen, an event which she, endowed with the gift of prophecy, had long foreseen and dreaded, she never ceased to love him. Yet, when he was hit by a poisoned arrow and implored her to heal his wounds by means of potent herbs, she refused or was forbidden to save him. He died, and overcome by grief and remorse, she killed herself, and both were buried in one tomb. There are classical reliefs, demonstrably known in the 16th century, where the youthful Paris, like Titian's shepherd, is clad in Phrygian trousers and makes music on a rustic instrument. And if the two figures in Titian's picture were interpreted as Paris and Oenone, still united but oppressed by the shadow of impending separation and doom, the gloomy grandeur of this melancholy pastoral would become understandable. It was inspired, I believe, by Ovid's treatment of the Oenone subject. In his Epistolae or Heroides, Ovid collected 21 imaginary letters written by the great lovers of the past. And the fifth of these letters, only 3 of them attributed to men, is addressed to Paris by the abandoned Oenone. She pours out her sorrows, she professes her lasting love, and she evokes the memory of their past happiness. You, now a son of Priam, were, to let respect give way to truth, a servant then. I deigned to wed a servant, I a nymph. Amidst the flocks we often took our rest, protected by a tree, and intermixed with leaves, the grass became our bridal bed. These lines, in the 5th of the Heroides, I submit anticipate not only the subject and the setting, the grassy ground, the goat nibbling at the foliage of the broken tree, the big protecting tree on the left. It also anticipates, I think, the very mood of Titian's Ultima Poesia. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Very good. Very good. I want to thank you for being so kind as being our lecturer for 1967.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I will not break the spell by thanking all of the many people who have made this possible, but again, let's thank Dr. Panofsky for being here.